COVID-19, a political theological diagnosis and prognosis. A correspondent recently brought to my attention a diagnosis of the political significance of the COVID-19, on account of which a genuine revolt of peoples around the world would have been sparked in opposition to governments trying to silence the virus spread in the interests of economic growth. This diagnosis is retraceable to the dominant narrative that has reached us from China, where whistleblowers would have spread the news of a terrible virus that the government would not have wanted anyone to know about. Or so it would seem. Yet seldom are things what they seem to be in politics. As for Chinese governmental strategies in particular, these hardly show any sign of immunity to the most virulent of Machiavellian antiques. Let us note parenthetically that there is debate today about the COVID-19 virus having been intentionally demonized by the Chinese government, which would have strategically boosted the official number of deaths related to respiratory problems in the city of Wuhan. On the other hand, it appears that anyone who has received a flu shot over the past 10 years would result positive to COVID-19 detection tests, so that many so-called positives could very well be fake positives. Now, the Chinese-spun narrative happens to fit comfortably within the mold of Western expectations. What more typical a 007 script than one in which a communist dictatorship would want to hide what a few whistleblowers will let everyone know around the world? Yet, one need not be as intelligent as Machiavelli to see that quarantines have served as preferred instrument of control in China, as they have in other countries where, for some years, governments had been struggling to contain increasing popular discontent. Suffice it to recall Emmanuel Macron's failure to tame France's yellow gilet until, that is, the imposition of a national quarantine. Those trusting the dominant Chinese-born narrative do not take into account the possibility, not to speak of a likelihood, that what is happening in China today follows the expectations of the Chinese government, rather than those of postmodern Westerners who believe that quarantines are what is good for them in the respect that they can help contain a pandemic, while we are all allowed to stay cozily at home and away from our old workplace, looking forward to a new post-quarantine world or life of ever-increased freedom via progressive reliance on technological mediation. Such a prospect would mark a great defeat for modern capitalism's wage slavery in favor of a more enlightened form of slavery. Or so it would seem. In effect, tyrannical governments feast upon popular fear, especially to the extent that the governments succeed in administrating it. In what way do national quarantines serve the interests of tyrannical governments? First, by repressing all pre-existing, lingering protests, justifying the systematic application of an iron fist to save the people, lest the virus contaminate them, although the real virus may be that of a rebellious spirit. Secondly, by distracting people or consolidating their alienation from the public sphere so that they may be ever more easily manipulated. But are today's tyrannical governments not primarily interested in economic growth inconsistent with quarantines? The right answer is no. At its present postmodern stage of development, modernity unfolds into a world government functioning according to a techno-mercantile logic. Whose interests do national quarantines not serve? Those of middle-class citizens striving to develop their life-sustaining activity independently of government control. Now, national quarantines obviously feed into the consolidation of government control of populations. What my interlocutor refers to as old plutocrats, most prominently President Trump, opposing quarantines, stands on the side of today's middle class against the rise of a global society compelling the middle class to regress onto the plane of a novel worldwide serfdom. Such a regression today comes via a substantive reduction of the world's population, which Pace technocracy's environmentalism does not pose a problem to the earth, but to a single tyrannical government attempting to consolidate its hegemony over the whole world. A substantive programmatic reduction of the world's population would be ill viewed by most people if it did not proceed under the cloak of measures imposed to save people's lives. Such measures would need to foster population reduction in the very act of inducing population growth. This is possible only through the weakening of people, or where they are rendered ever more vulnerable to the least of dangers. The most efficient way for a global tyrannical government to reduce the world's population would not be to introduce a disease capable of killing a large segment of the world's population, but to impose a regime rendering everyone progressively susceptible to being killed by the least of environmental modifications. What can stop today's world population from posing a threat to a global tyranny's project to manage or manipulate modern freedom to serve interests alien to it? One possible answer would point to the rise of a firm religious critique of freedom, calling all men to abandon it by submitting to the demands of universal peace on earth. Another, if only complementary, answer is given by fear of violent death, which may appear in the guise of a virus psychosis. In either case, modern freedom is brought into radical question. Yet, it would be a mistake to assume that modern freedom is a mere victim of foreign enemies. As the 19th century has well shown us, modern optimism, or the modern dream of historical progress, tends towards disenchantment. Modern man is great at fighting for freedom, but very poor at fighting freely, that is, at defending the freedom he has gained. That is because of relative failure to swear by a natural telos, or proper meaning of freedom. Not unlike his decadent counterpart in imperial Rome, modern man is not confident about the right way to live out his gained freedom. His defense of freedom is consequently weak and incapable of withstanding firm critiques against, if not outright barbaric assaults upon, all freedom. Unsurprisingly, as the lighthouse of modern freedom, contemporary academia remains by and large submissive to the consolidation of a global tyranny. At the very least, contemporary intellectuals tend to be utterly ineffective in mobilizing people against the threat posed by globalization to genuine or political freedom. Overall, contemporary intellectuals are no less collaborationists with respect to the rise of tyranny than most of their German or French predecessors were in the 1930s. Today, political opposition to the globalist trend is still sustainable, albeit at an important condition. The recovery of a religiosity capable of sustaining the flourishing of freedom against its primary detractors or repressors, or more simply, against tyranny. Now, insofar as tyranny today is most fully incarnated by the machinery of a global techno-plutocracy, old-school capitalism fights, relatively speaking, on the front of the middle class, and thus of freedom, properly understood, that is, republican freedom. While capitalism can fight on freedom's side, it cannot ground genuine freedom, which stands or falls on its two pillars of constitutional law and a religion compatible with it. The recovery of a right mode of religiosity is of paramount importance to the cause of freedom, as tyranny sets out to repress freedom today in the most insidious and pervasive manner. That is why today libertines invoking freedom as an end in itself fail miserably to withstand the tsunami of the globalization of physical, moral, and intellectual life. If freedom is to rise above the rules and regulations of a world dictatorship, it will need to withstand the hardships of mountain climbing. But this is possible only given proper rootedness, or by returning to standards of good living transcending positive right or sheer governmental dictates. A return to moral duty is of utmost importance as we attempt to rise over and above moral duty's sham postmodern imitation, namely responsibility to submit to the logic of radical collaborationism. What a few decades ago was justly said in Nuremberg remains valid today as well. The appeal to authorities' dictates is no excuse for evil doings. By uncritically executing orders, we are in no manner of speech immune to evil and just condemnation thereof. Neither physical might nor any intellectual probity could ever render expendable our duty to be fully human by recognizing the primacy of moral virtue over any responsibility to follow commands. In order to successfully oppose their demise at the hands of global tyranny, modern freedom fighters must recover consciousness of the primacy of moral virtue over both intellectual expertise. Let us recall how many experts planned out Nazi exterminations, and physical or military might. As Socrates taught us, properly understood moral virtue does not hide in private caves, but steps out of them in open squares, knowing itself in the act of living publicly, confronting itself with common problems, and indeed exposing all cave dwellers to the irreducible reality of a res publica, the common good. What resources does modern man have to recover moral virtue or to work towards the restoration of moral virtue as foremost guarantor against tyranny? The obvious answer is, to repeat, twofold: constitutional law and a religion compatible with it. It follows that in the West, politically authoritative representatives of modern freedom against the onslaught of global tyranny ought to appeal to both a legal constitution and Christian religiosity, and the latter above all, in the respect that, in the face of death, the otherworldly stands as the only solid justification of worldly success. It behooves old-school capitalists, as prominent representatives of modern liberalism, to fully recognize our need to return to religion, not as a mere ally of capitalism, but as foremost foundation of a freedom that will not find it demeaning to cut a deal with capitalism, particularly lest capitalism convert into the instrument of tyranny, as it has done, most notably in present-day China.